Today we encounter the Old Testament book of Joshua, a book we don't hear from very often in church. It's in our Bibles, but it's a difficult book for modern Christians to relate to, in part because of its extreme violence. When we do hear from the book of Joshua, it's usually not from the violent parts. But the violence in Joshua and elsewhere in the Old Testament is something for us to be aware of, because too often it has been used to provide biblical justification for wars of invasion, particularly invasions, not self-defense, but invasions. The invasion of Ukraine, for example. Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, has claimed that the invasion of Ukraine was at least partially justified or needed to defend Russia's Orthodox Christian faith from its enemies. Now, most of the Orthodox Church worldwide does not agree with this, and certainly Ukraine does not agree. Yet it is an example of biblical or Christian justification for a modern invasion. And this is not a new thing. It represents a consistent historical theme that Christian instigators of war have used to justify invasions ever since Christianity was adopted by Rome 1,700 years ago. The argument boiling down to the claim that war is biblical, that war is God's will for humankind, that it's normal, and even our best choice. This is an argument that harkens back to pagan thinking. Such arguments are difficult to defend in the light of the example of Jesus Christ, yet they persist to this day because the Old Testament can seem to support it. And the Old Testament does contain a lot of stories about battles and wars, with the book of Joshua perhaps being the most vivid example. Of course, the book of Joshua is more than just about war and conquest. The book of Joshua is also a testimony of faith. It's also a spiritual covenant, and it's a record of events and more. And while there's more to the book of Joshua than just war and conquest, Joshua does contain considerable violence, all in the name of God. And given Christianity's checkered past in this area in general, we need to be honest about how our Bible and how Joshua can be twisted and used to justify invasions, and how it's happened in the past and still continues to happen today. For those who don't remember where Joshua fits in the Bible, Joshua is ancient. Long before Jesus, long before most of the Bible was written, so long ago that we should expect some amount of magical and pagan thinking is in play. Now, Joshua comes right after Moses. If you remember the timeline, Moses frees the slaves from Egypt, escapes into the wilderness, and they begin to look for a place to settle down, a place that Moses refers to as the Promised Land. Moses himself never makes it. He doesn't live long enough to make it to the Promised Land, and Joshua, who today's book was named after, becomes the leader after Moses. Then the people, as led by Joshua, arrive at the Promised Land, and it is beautiful. It is a great place. There's water, fresh water, great soil, a wonderful climate. It's an amazing place to settle down. There's one big problem, though, and it's a biggie. There's already people there. People who are not interested in leaving. People who are not interested in being the victim of a military invasion either. In the story, God commands Joshua to invade and kill many of these people in a series of battles in what can look to modern eyes, to modern readers, almost like a genocide. The story of Joshua describes how Joshua's army, in some instances, under God's direction, killed every man, woman, child, and animal. Total destruction. So this is why we don't hear from the book of Joshua very often. It's a hard story. We don't like the idea that God could have commanded such violence directly. And Joshua's not the only place we find this kind of violence either. It's found elsewhere in the Old Testament as well. Since such violence is in our Bibles, I don't want us to be ignorant or in denial about that history. But I also don't want us to think that it's necessarily okay to emulate such violence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the book of Joshua is not just about violence. It's violence. The violence that is there is accompanied by stories of miracles that came about due to God's intervention and that convinced the people that the one God is speaking through Joshua. And not just any God, but the one true God, Yahweh, who was seen as the God of war at that time. So from a theological or a spiritual growth perspective, this was a pivotal moment in time. It was a time when there were believed to be many gods, but more important, this is when the concept of a single God was planted as a new idea, a new seed that would take thousands of years to grow. So these stories had this underlying purpose, that purpose being this transition from a belief that there were many gods to a belief that the God the Jewish people knew was the most powerful of the many gods, and finally to the belief we know of today, monotheism, the belief in one God. These stories, this history, was told over and over verbally for generations before it was written down, with its main purpose being to transition humanity to this understanding, this belief in God as one, as a single all-powerful God, as a shared God. The book of Joshua describes the part of our faith history, our biblical history, when the Jewish people were in the middle of this transition. Really, at this point in Joshua, they're just starting the transition. At that time, of the many gods that the people believed in, the God of war was considered the most important one, and for good reason. When we read the Old Testament, it's very clear how important it was to the overall story to keep the Jewish people from falling back into a belief in many gods. So we see this problem come up over and over again in the Old Testament, this tension between many gods, the God of war, and the one true God. Also remember in biblical texts that it's not the strongest army that wins. It's the army that has the most powerful God. The gods of the pagan world were always fighting with one another. So it's assumed that war was the natural way to deal with conflict. The one God was not like that. The one God teaches us to love our neighbor, not to go to war against them. The story of Joshua's conquest was about establishing the reality that there was only one true God, one source of life, at a time when the conventional wisdom was that there were many gods, and that the greatest of all the gods was first the God of armies, or hosts, as armies were sometimes called back then. So you've heard the term, the Lord of hosts. It's literally the Lord of armies. It was a midpoint in the transition between multiple gods and the understanding that we hold today. So the story of Joshua, in the story of Joshua's complete destruction of all the men, women, children, and animals in those lands would have represented evidence that the God of armies, that the real God, which eventually became the only God, had succeeded. Ancient people believed that to kill off or destroy a pagan god, you had to destroy all of that god's followers, adults, children, and even animals. So they're playing out this pagan belief. Joshua's armies conquered the pagans in ways that should not have been humanly possible. So it serves as a dramatic, miraculous example of the one true God's power over the false pagan gods that were worshipped at that time. The book of Joshua ends shortly after today's story when Joshua addresses the people and counsels them to choose to serve the true God, not the gods of Egypt or the local gods. This ending, the way it kind of all wraps up so neatly, is part of what leads some scholars to view the description of these wars as allegory and as an external story about what is ultimately an internal battle. Also note that as the story wraps up, Joshua is telling the people to choose between the many pagan gods and the one true God. This is not a choice between being an atheist and being a believer. That's a modern understanding. That's not what's going on here. The question was not about belief in God. Everybody believed in God in ancient times, of course. The question was which. Like we often find in Bible stories, there are multiple layers of meaning that will be helpful to different people depending on where you are in your spiritual development in your life. As a literal story, it's a story about war in the name of God, about the God of armies defeating the other less powerful gods, and eventually becoming recognized as the one true God. Theologically, this story represents a turning point in the spiritual development of humankind, from our understanding of the universe as a competition, a violent competition between many gods, to experiencing the universe as a single God of peace. When viewed as a metaphor, the story can also represent our own internal spiritual battle and our own spiritual growth process. We each fight this battle within ourselves as we grow spiritually. The gods of wealth, fame, fear, self-centeredness arise in our lives over and over again, and they must be defeated. And sometimes it is a battle we win, but just as often we don't win. We fall short, just as the people did in this ancient story. The world of many gods is the world of selfishness, of my God is better than your God, of bigotry, of violence, and of war, all of which is still very alive and present in humanity to this day. All of which must be wiped out if we're going to grow spiritually. As we grow spiritually, we live out this story of Joshua fighting for the promised land. We battle false gods such as greed and vanity and selfish desire. But our internal battle is not about violence, it's about diligence. When we look at the world as a my God against your God or my God against the godless, we've taken a big step backwards. Or when we think that we need to invade another country because it's God's plan, we fall back into this historic pagan pattern. Even though Joshua is an ancient book, our personal and collective spiritual development has still not reached the point that we're able to fully heed theological guidance that Joshua offers us. The guidance that we consistently choose to serve the God of love rather than following false gods. It's like we're all still spiritually somewhere in between. A people with many gods and a people who all share the same reality, who all share the same God. This is where Joshua's final guidance comes in, because it's up to each of us to make this choice of who we're going to serve. Or do we even look at that? Do we even consider, who am I serving in this effort that I'm in? Who am I serving in my life? Are we going to commit to serving a God who is love so that we become an expression of love ourselves, or are we going to serve someone or something else? For example, do we choose wealth for ourselves, me first, at the expense of others? Or do we seek spiritual growth? Do we seek to grow according to the example provided by Jesus Christ? When we actively choose the oneness of God, it facilitates our growth, and we move away from trusting in ourselves and trusting in violence to trusting in love and practicing nonviolence. When the main tool we use to solve our big problems is violence, then violence has become our God. Do I need to say that again? All right, because if that's the tool that we think is the best, that is right for the really bad situations. Are we really serving the one God? Well, in the context of Jesus Christ, violence is a false God. And we can so easily step back from a God of love to a God of war if we're not careful. Choosing one God is about choosing nonviolence because a single shared God should result in a single shared humanity. And Jesus exemplified this on the cross, as he's dying, as he's being tortured to death. Jesus refuses to lash out in violence. He has all the power of God available to him. He refuses to use that, even if it means losing his own life. Why? To show us the way forward. Jesus experienced those who were killing him as still being God's children, even though they believed in pagan gods. Many of them, the Romans certainly. He still saw the people who were killing them as God's children, as God's creation, savable and forgivable. That's a hard example to live, but it's the example that we've been provided. When we experience reality as one unified whole, as one God, that opens the door to a much wider view, a much more accurate perspective of life, a perspective that is love, is peace, that is grace, that is mercy, a perspective of love for all of God's creation. Doing God's will is more often than not doing what's best for everyone, even doing what's best for our enemy. Jesus said, love your enemy. And not just in war between nations. Decisions involving war and peace happen at every level of life. From our internal fight against selfishness, to our conflicts with our neighbors, to our political divisions. Because such decision, such discernment is rarely easy or obvious. Because of that, we use spiritual practices such as prayer, meditation, reflection, and discussion with each other to support our discernment efforts. And it's not just our intentions that are important. It's not just what we intend. It's the results that matter. If the decisions we are making lead to more love, lead to less selfishness, to less violence, to reduced division, to peaceful results, we have some pretty good assurance that we're headed in the right direction. That's why it's maybe more important to look at our results than our intentions. If our decisions, on the other hand, lead to division, violence, and war, conflict, we might be on the path of Joshua, but we are certainly not on the path of Jesus Christ. Russia's leader in some of his arguments tried to use faith and religion to justify and to continue his invasion, just like Joshua did. But Russia is not Joshua. Unlike Joshua, there's little sign or spiritual basis for Russia's claim, at least in my opinion. And the Russian people, just like us in the U.S. and the people in Ukraine, we all should know better because this is the modern world. We all have the benefit of knowing the example of Jesus Christ. We all know about the Prince of Peace. The largest religion in Russia by far is Christianity. The Russian Orthodox Church has carried the banner of Christianity for almost 2,000 years. I don't want to lean too heavily on Russia, maybe I already have, because they're not the only country who's done this. We've done it too. The U.S. is also engaged in questionable wars. The U.S. has also sometimes followed Joshua rather than Jesus. But truly, shouldn't we know better by now? We have the whole Bible. We have the example of Jesus. Yet over and over again, we're faced with these choices, big and small, as individuals, as a church, as a nation, as a world. Who are you going to serve? Will we choose the false gods of human power, greed, of might and money, of vanity and ego? Or we choose the humility that comes from serving the one true God, which, by the way, means to serve each other. to love one another with Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, as our example. The choice of who to serve is ours, individually, as a church, as a nation, and as a world. Choose well.